So I made a promise to myself, you know, years ago that I would never vote for someone who supported the Iraq war. So I was kind of looking forward to voting in this election, but then the genocide in Gaza was kind of a deal breaker for me. So looks like I'll be sitting this one out again. At least as far as the presidential election goes, like local elections, I'm pretty in tune with. But
Is that something that you've admitted out loud to the public?
I don't think I've admitted to the public. I admit it to people who ask. But I mean, I don't know. But that's just like a personal intricacy. I don't bring it up because I just feel like people harp on that mode of political activity a bit too much. Um, as far as like that being the limit of people's politics, I just want people to think bigger. But I don't know. The world is full of Philistines.
Did you see the scuttlebutt around Chappell Roan's non-endorsement of Kamala Harris?
Who's not endorsement?
Oh my goodness gracious. Chappell Roan. Are you the last living American? I thought I was the last one to get on board this particular musical train, but apparently
Is
it's
that
you. Do you really don't know who she is?
a country singer?
No, she's like a pop singer, I guess, who apparently exploded onto the stage pretty recently around April. I think it was her performance at the big Boston, whatever they call their version of like a governor's ball, that sort of went viral and everyone started paying attention. And basically every song off of her first album is dominating the charts. And people really love her because she seems sort of indie and queer coded and sort of like Gaga adjacent, but Gaga was coming up during more of an electronic dance sort of an era. And Chappell Roan, some people make comparisons to like Kate Bush. Some people hate those comparisons, but she has more of like an indie credibility and vibe, I'd say.
Right.
Anyway, the point is that she has been vocal in her support of Palestine. And then relatively recently, she was asked in an interview about whether or not she was planning to endorse Kamala Harris.
I just woke up and to like people just skewing it even more. Endorsing and voting are completely different. I don't agree with a lot of what is going on with like policies. Like, obviously, fuck the policies of the right, but also fuck some of the policies on the left. That's why I can't endorse. That's why I can't like put my entire name and my entire project behind one. Because there is no way I can stand behind some of the left's completely transphobic and completely genocidal views. So yeah, there are huge problems on both. You know what is right and wrong, and so do I. Fuck Trump for fucking real, but fuck some of the shit that has gone down in the Democratic Party that has failed people like me and you.
I think Taylor Swift endorsing put some of the pressure on her, and as another like major pop girly to endorse. Also, of course, Charlie XCX dubbing Kamala Harris brat over the summer was a big pop culture boon for her. So in this interview, she basically says like she has a lot of concerns and there's a lot of like shitty options out there on both sides of the aisle, and that we should ask for more than the options that were being presented. And as you can imagine, that very reasonable statement did not go over very well.
Yeah, I can
So
imagine
she,
the vote blue crowd, no matter who, probably responded very reasonably and understandably and with grace and humility.
yeah, exactly wrong. She got a lot of bullying. The Zionist accounts really attacked her, and she got like kind of browbeaten into giving a follow-up statement where she says she will vote for Kamala, but she doesn't like it. Like she's not happy about it. Let me see if I can find it. She says, uh, if you come to my shows, if you read my full interviews, if you literally know anything about me and for what I stand for, you know that this is not lip service. This is not virtue signaling. Actions speak louder than words, and actions speak louder than an endorsement. So hearing from my mouth, if you're still wondering, no, I'm not voting for Donald Trump. And yes, I will always question those in power and those making decisions over other people. And I will stand up for what's right and what I believe in. She then went on to say on last Wednesday, I don't agree with a lot of what's going on with like policies, like obviously fuck the policies on the right, but also fuck some of the policies on the left. Fuck Trump for fucking real, but fuck some of the shit that has gone down with the Democratic Party that has failed people like me and you, and more so Palestine, and more so every marginalized community in the world. So yeah, I'm voting for fucking Kamala, but I'm not settling for what's been offered because that's questionable. And people are like literally losing their minds over this.
Why didn't she write the letter for the uncommitted movement? That's my question.
What do you mean? Why didn't she write the letter to the uncommitted movement?
It just sounded like, did you read that one?
No. Whose letter to the uncommitted movement?
It was by the uncommitted movement, rather.
Oh, to Kamala Harris?
It was just a general statement, like they're just not going to endorse her. But at the same time, they didn't tell voters, they didn't, 740,000 uncommitted voters during the primary. Like they carried some serious political weight.
Yeah, no, I did. I'm sorry, go ahead.
They didn't offer an instruction of who to vote for instead. And some of them came out and said, well, I'm going to vote for Kamala anyway. just kind of like,
Yeah, I mean, like, look, I say, people are losing their minds about the non-endorsement, but like, understandably, if I were, coconut pilled, as it were, I think it is right to read an unwillingness to endorse Kamala Harris as an openness to voting for someone else. I think the stupid part is thinking that someone like Chappell Roan, who again is like very queer coded and talks a lot about the interests of the LGBTQIA community and stuff like that, is going to vote for Trump. The problem is we live in this world where the existence of the two-party binary enables people making these arguments as though she is going to make a binary choice and is not going to vote for a third-party candidate. And I see her struggling with this. And this is part of why I think it's very important to have strong third parties, no matter how much you might be frustrated with what they're doing or, not being bigger or more successful or whatever, is that you need a landing zone. If you don't have like a rhetorical landing spot, it's very easy for people to characterize you as wanting to help Trump or wanting to be the other, instead of saying, I'm making an argument that the Democratic Party should be closer to where Jill Stein is, and maybe my vote could be moved if you, stopped a genocide or stopped providing weapons to a genocider. Which kind of brings us to why you're here today, Stephen Semler. Welcome back to the podcast. For those, again, who started listening without reading who the guest is today, we have Stephen Semler, who is an expert on the provision of American arms to places around the world. And in particular, we're interested in America's role today in funding Israel, especially as it has started about a week ago its newest siege on Lebanon. Welcome back to the podcast.
It's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
All right. So, Stephen, I was reading actually a piece in The Intercept recently, which you were interviewed and in which you were quoted. And that's part of why I had the instinct to reach out today. The piece was published a couple of days ago on September 23rd, titled Israel Bombed Lebanon Today, Killing Hundreds. The U.S. is sending more bombs. We haven't actually covered this subject since this latest round of attacks started. So I'm just going to read the first few lines of this to provide some background. And then want to come to you and ask you to fill in some holes as to how we got to this place. So this piece starts, it's in The Intercept. The Israeli military has embarked upon a massive bombing campaign in Lebanon last week. Of course, it began with a remote detonation of thousands of personal electronic devices. On Friday, an Israeli strike leveled a building in the Beirut suburbs. On Sunday and into Monday, the bombings expanded into the largest attack on Lebanon since Israel's 2006 invasion. All told, the Israeli military bombed 1,300 targets, killing at least 490 people, including more than 90 children and women. Now, you were quoted in this article a little bit later, talking about the likelihood that the bombs that are being used against Lebanon are American in origin, that it would almost be an impossibility that weren't the case. But before we get into the details of that, let's step back a second and remind the audience how all of this started.
Well, as far as Hezbollah starting, Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, and there wasn't Hezbollah. By the time they left, there was Hezbollah. So that's a very annotated history of Hezbollah. But around essentially the day after October 7th, to compel Israel to stop bombing Gaza, because by even like a few hours, like it was already clear that this was going to be a historically destructive bombing campaign at the very least. So to exact costs on Israel, to essentially raise the costs of their assault on Gaza, they started firing rockets at military installations. And it has been going on, I mean, since October consistently, and Israel has responded in kind. As far as the number of munitions that have been fired, UNIFIL, the interim force in Lebanon that maintains this presence along the south following the 2006 war, has tracked projectiles flying in both directions. And from October to June, Israel had fired about 11,000 munitions. Now, and Hezbollah had fired, around 2,500. Now, it's a vast undercount, especially for Israel, because the radar just can't pick up other projectiles like missiles. It doesn't track aerial assaults either. So on Monday, this week, or even over the last 2 weeks, represent a major escalation, especially this week. On Monday, Israel bombed 1,600 targets in Lebanon. And for reference, on average, the U.S. bombed ISIS during its counter-ISIS campaign in Iraq and Syria fewer than 500 times per week. And Israel bombed Lebanon at least 1,600 in one day. So what's transpired is a massive escalation. It's definitely war, contrary to what the Biden administration says. The U.S. is definitely complicit in this war as well. And the reason I told The Intercept that I'd be stunned that there wouldn't be, if there wasn't U.S. munitions used in Israel's current onslaught of Lebanon, is because Israel relies so heavily on U.S. munitions. I mean, they're constantly redlining their stockpiles, even with the Biden administration expediting sales, allowing Israel to draw from U.S. stockpiles in Israel itself, and with $18 billion in military aid. So it's really, that's the reason why I said it, because Israel depends fully on U.S. munitions, and Netanyahu, other ministers, they've more or less admitted that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been hearing this language of escalating to de-escalate kind of offered up as the rationale for Israel's bombardment. Before we get into some clips, I think, where you've seen reporters push back a little bit on what that means, and we can get into the details of what Antony Blinken, for example's response to that pushback have been. What do you make of that framing?
I mean, they talk about this war like they're talking about the weather, like it just fell from this, like it's just like these bombs are just falling from the sky like an act of God. It's, and I think part of the strategy, especially, I mean, for Israel and the United States, is to disconnect this escalation between Israel and Lebanon from the struggle in Gaza. But Hezbollah has been clear that this is about Gaza. I mean, in the same way that the Houthis have been clear about their attacks on global shipping, that, I mean, the Houthis actually stated that they're invoking Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. They just view these attacks as, part of their duties to impose costs on Israel. And other groups that are also Iran-aligned in Iraq and Syria are attacking U.S. troops for the same reason. They're trying to impose costs on the United States, just like Hezbollah is for Israel, to raise the costs and to try to compel Israel to finally agree to a ceasefire. But as far as the escalation discourse goes, I mean, they still talk about it as, just a random act or something that's just happening independent of Gaza, but that's clearly not the case.
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate always before going to what I'm about to say as explanation, because we live in a political climate where bringing up identity has been weaponized in a lot of ways very destructively and against my political interests and what I believe the interests of a lot of the groups whose identity are being weaponized want, actually. But it is increasingly difficult to disentangle the presumption that the Arab groups in these scenarios are inherently violent, they're warmongering, they just want there to be conflict. It's hard to disentangle that presumption from the rationale that are being presented by American political leadership as to why the standard should be so different when discussing war crimes committed by one group versus another. There was actually a clip that I didn't plan to talk about today, but let me pull this up really quickly that really foregrounded it. Last week's guest, Dr. Asselrod, had retweeted it, and I was losing my mind. In it, one of the State Department spokespeople is asked to opine on the pager attack in Lebanon. Here, I'm putting it in the Slack now, Armand. And listen for the double standard that quickly emerges as to the American government's willingness to opine on violations of international law when they are conducted by our so-called allies.
We all know that Secretary Austin is always in contact with his Israeli counterpart. Does the Secretary have any objections to the way Israel is conducting its operations inside Lebanon?
In terms of?
In terms of, as you may know, targeting civilians, maybe carpet bombing to the villages along the border.
Well, I mean, something that we've raised is we don't want to see this escalate. And any time that there is actions taken that could further escalate the war, that's not, or like a broader conflict, that we want to avoid a regional war. The secretary, in all of his conversations, urges restraint and urges, the Israelis to consider civilian casualties, and that's something that we've said from the very beginning. Look, I'm not going to get into more details on their private conversations, but of course it's something that the secretary discusses with his counterpart and will continue to raise.
I mean, could you confirm if the secretary told Gallant that they need to avoid the infrastructure in Lebanon?
I think what I can tell you is what I reiterated earlier, is that, of course, we are always concerned where there are strikes in areas where there is a concentrated civilian population. That's something that the secretary raises on his calls with Minister Gallant. It's something that, at different levels in this building, we also raise with our Israeli counterparts, but I'm just not going to be able to go beyond that.
Okay, so the new standard is apparently that the U.S. is not going to opine on operations that it's not a part of. Is that something that's usual in your experience, Stephen? Does America not opine on, let's say, what Russia is doing in Ukraine or what any of our political, quote unquote, enemies are doing elsewhere on the globe?
No, the U.S. is very quick to condemn war crimes when they're not committed by Israel, for sure. On October 7th, for example, Hamas very clearly committed war crimes. And then ever since October 7th, Israel has been conducting war crimes every single day that the Biden administration just refuses to acknowledge. And it's not just, the existence of these war crimes in Gaza, it's the U.S. complicity in it. I mean, for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, I read about 20 instances in which Israel had used U.S. provided weapons in apparent war crimes. I say apparent because it's not my decision to eventually rule that that's like an international tribunal, but very clearly war crimes. And certainly enough evidence there for the U.S., if it was any other country doing it, to declare that, yes, these are rampant, very clear war crimes. But they didn't. It's always, well, I can't speculate. She actually, the Pentagon spokesperson in the clip you just showed just said, actually called it a hypothetical, even though it's a very real thing. Like, she caught herself towards the end.
Right.
Just acting like this isn't real. But I mean, not just going back to what I was saying earlier, just the weapons that I tracked in war crimes, not just US made and US supplied, but US made and US supplied after October 7th. So very clearly the same types of weapons that Biden has expedited to Israel, has provided unconditionally, are being used in real time. And you can see the difference. I'm going off a slight tangent here, but it'll be over quickly. One thing I noticed is that the administration has tried to wean Israel off using 2,000-pound bombs in Gaza. So if you recall early on, I mean, the administration has already provided Israel over 14,000 of these 2,000-pound bombs, but has it encouraged, gently nudged, as the Biden administration does, Israel to use smaller 250-pound bombs, which are still, catastrophically deadly and still enormous. I mean, it's the size of a very large person, these bombs are. And as I was tracking the forensic evidence showing the types of war crimes committed with different types of U.S. weapons, I noticed a very clear pattern that in 2023, there was lots and lots of instances of war crimes committed with 2,000-pound bombs. And then after the Biden administration, to some extent, successfully weaned Israel off using them and towards the 250-pound bombs, I noticed a ton of war crimes committed with the 250-pound bombs. So it was just Israel using more precise munitions to more precisely target civilian areas.
So what do you, when you say that you're tracking war crimes committed with 250-pound bombs, I mean, what does that look like? What are the kind of war crimes you're describing? Is it targeting civilian areas, as you just mentioned? There's all kind of dispute that's been happening since the beginning as to what constitutes a civilian area, as you well know. But how are you logistically tracking that?
Well, I'm usually just taking war crimes that were essentially already declared by some other human rights organization. So I worked off that, and then I cross-referenced it with the forensic evidence available. So usually fragments of munitions indicate the type of munition involved. And then I cross-reference that with what we know about U.S. arms transfers to Israel so far. Because unlike for Ukraine, the Biden administration is very loud and proud about it. They characterize Army Ukraine effectively as industrial policy. They publish maps showing where the munitions are made, which is something that the arms industry does often, by the way. But for Israel, it keeps everything below board. It only reveals arms transfers when they have to, when it exceeds a certain threshold where it triggers notification to Congress, which is why the Biden administration has spread out the arms transfers to keep it below a certain value to avoid triggering that congressional notification. All this to say is that, the war crimes I'm talking about were like, they targeted schools, they targeted churches, they targeted aid groups. Examples of aid groups giving the Israeli military their location through a process called deconfliction, and then being attacked at that same location. I saw, I tracked 14 instances of that happening. But yeah, the war crimes committed always involve some sort of, they always touch on the issue of proportionality and distinction as well. So just distinguishing between military objects and civilian objects, and also just weighing the expected civilian cost deaths, really, when they're attacking a military objective. But it's clear that Israel's just turning out targets. It's just a carpet bombing campaign.
Yeah, I'm struck by your choice to kind of caveat, your description of those war crimes as like, probable, or whatever you said, war crimes caveated only because they have not been, or some of them have not been deemed as such by international legal organizations. But that's part of what seems so despairing about this moment, is that we've had a year now of attempts of international actors to come to these conclusions and impose some consequences for Israel's behavior in America's complicity. But for various reasons, whether it's a U.S. veto or the fact that no one can force America to stop supplying these weapons, or most recently, the most recent story, the bombshell that Antony Blinken received reports that war crimes were committed that would preclude America under our own laws from providing Israel with additional weapons, and lied about it so that the United States could continue providing these weapons. That knowledge being what it is, those instances being what they are, it is a little overwhelming to try to think of what mechanisms remain for there to be accountability.
Right. Which, I mean, even looking at the US system, I mean, it just seems like it's a political choice when and whether to apply these mechanisms at all. So what you just referred to was, you were referring to the ProPublica story about how
Yes.
Blinken, like, there's clear evidence within his department that Israel was blocking humanitarian assistance to Gaza, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that is one legal provision where, the government has like an army of lawyers. I think this one genuinely took everyone by surprise because it's not necessarily obscure. I mean, it's been around for decades, but it just never happens. It just never happens. Like a country that receives US military assistance also blocking humanitarian assistance somehow. It just never happens. Like, so for example, like when ISIS was holding siege to various, towns in Iraq and Syria, and like the 20 teens, like between 2014 and 2019, the Biden administration would use food airdrops to reach these besieged towns. And now they're using airdrops in Gaza. It's such a bizarre circumstance where you can't imagine any US ally willingly blocking US humanitarian aid like that. It just doesn't happen. You have, having worked in the humanitarian sector myself, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, he of course blocked humanitarian aid, but he wasn't receiving US military assistance. So that's the reason why it's such a crazy situation that this law even came up.
Yeah, I mean, it really sort of shines a spotlight on this weird gaslighting that we've all been enduring for the last year, because, I mean, to your point, the fact that the U.S. was forced to drop aid via air, at least one shipment of which ended up killing a child. All of this gets memory hold because so many atrocities happen on a daily basis. But the very fact that they were in the position to have to deliver the aid that way was a consequence of the aid blockade that was happening on the ground, where trucks were lined up with materials spoiling and settlers protesting outside their entry, and flagrant barring of these trucks getting into Gaza. But we were told by these Israeli spokespeople and the American spokespeople that parrot their narratives that this many trucks got in today, right? Ignoring that it's 1/5 of the number of aid trucks that were getting in prior to October 7th. And ignoring all of the things that we could see with our eyes, the obstruction of the trucks lined up on the other side of the Gaza border, unable to get in. And so the fact now that you have Blinken trying to, I assessed all the information and established that we weren't actually precluded from continuing to provide these arms. Like, Israel needs to do better, but it wasn't enough to actually bar America under our own laws from continuing to provide weapons. It's just like, what do you even say at this point? It's crazy that we were even having to have a debate about whether or not Israel was restricting aid. And now he can basically get away with saying it was fine. What I did was fine, with impunity in these interviews, because of these layers and layers of misinformation that have been happening for years, for a year. Maybe we should go ahead and play one of the clips of Blinken kind of defending this position. Let's play the first one, the CBS interview, Armand.
Mr. Secretary, ProPublica has determined that 2 agencies found that Israel is deliberately stopping humanitarian aid from getting to civilians. And as you well know, the U.S. government says that it has to restrict supplying weapons to a country that does this type of thing. Why have we not done so?
Yeah. So this is actually pretty typical. We had a report to put out on the humanitarian situation in Gaza and what Israel was doing to try to make sure that people got the assistance they needed. And I had different assessments from different parts of the State Department, from other agencies that were involved, like USAID. My job is to sort through them, which I did, draw some conclusions from that, and we put out our report. And we found that Israel needed to do a better job on the humanitarian assistance. We've seen improvements since then. It's still not sufficient.
What do you make of that, Stephen?
Sounds like Tony's in full cover your ass mode. I mean, because I think that, everything he said is wrong. Like, as I was just saying, like, nothing about this is typical. It's completely wild that this is happening. And one of the things that one of the main takeaways that I had from the ProPublica report, because this has been known that Israel is blocking humanitarian aid forever. Like Stacey Gilbert, former State Department employee, resigned months ago because she claimed the very thing that the ProPublica article says, which is that this document went against expert opinion and was essentially doctored before being delivered to Congress. The Biden administration effectively lied to Congress in order to keep providing weapons to Israel, which is a huge moral low. And again, very, very, I mean, the 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act being invoked at all is just, it's so beyond the pale that just fits right in with the current moment. But what Blinken's saying just doesn't make sense, because one of the things that you take away from that ProPublica report is that essentially most like USAID, other elements of State Department, they're all pretty much in agreement that Israel is blocking humanitarian aid. And the story was that under pressure from State Department leadership, that all these different agencies started to fall in line. And, so as a result, there was mixed opinion in the end, but it was after being strong-armed. So he essentially doctored what evidence he was accruing. And there's nothing in the law that says he couldn't have listened to the 250 humanitarian human rights groups who months ago signed a letter endorsing an arms embargo on Israel, in part because Israel was orchestrating a famine in Gaza, in part by blocking humanitarian aid. So it's just such a bizarre and frankly just an unbelievable experience. Like, we're going on a year of this conflict, and I'm still continually shocked by these developments. It's stunning.
I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, that's what's so despairing about it. It's like, I was saying this to Dr. Rod last week, that I sometimes don't know. I feel like diminishing benefit in covering every new development, because it feels like the most obvious, cruel, illegal, inhumane thing in the world happens on a weekly basis. You have videos of it. You have testimonial about it. You have international aid organizations and legal organizations calling it out. And then you see the government officials responsible being able to act like with impunity the way that Blinken is in this video, in part because there is a crisis of the fourth estate and nothing in the way of follow-up questions apparently to that answer. I think it was Glenn Greenwald and some others who were pointing out that they simply could have asked him, well, what were the reports that were arguing that Israel isn't blocking humanitarian aid? Who is it that you were relying upon if you sorted through all of the evidence and decided to believe this evidence more than all of the evidence on the other side? What was it? Why was it so compelling to you? Why do you dismiss all of this and then read off the litany of evaluations that have established that Israel is in fact blocking aid? And of course we didn't get that. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt there. I just don't understand. I don't believe Blinken when he said he had information that Israel wasn't blocking humanitarian aid. I think it was my hunch, within their confines of government, that Israel was blocking humanitarian, just overwhelming evidence of it. I mean, irrefutable, the stuff you mentioned, and I mean, USAID's own testimony, and those, the former Obama officials that are now head these agencies. It's just irrefutable. I think he's just making it up as it goes along.
Right. But absolutely, which is why I think it would be beneficial at very least to have a journalist expose the kind of facial flaw, like the blatant lying that's happening there. But I think, unfortunately, to a lot of viewers who listen to that, I mean, it's going to be largely inscrutable. I don't know the extent to which, maybe you can help me understand because I don't watch cable. I don't know the extent to which the ProPublica article is actually being covered, directly on these mainstream programs, as opposed to giving Blinken an opportunity to come on and perhaps spin it. So if a listener is hearing about this from the first time in the context of an interview like this, or has heard very little else about it outside of the context of Blinken being able to add his spin, do they basically accept that rationale as appropriate, that some angry anti-war lefties who are never happy about anything want to believe the worst about Israel, but Blinken's saying, hey, it actually wasn't that bad and we have to keep defending our ally.
I don't have a competent answer for you, but I don't think anyone does. But I do find comfort in the poll numbers that people are seeing through his bullshit. Whether it relates, who knows what this case or the law that would require the U.S. to cut off arms because of Israel's blocking humanitarian assistance. I think overall, even though it takes an order of magnitude more effort to refute bullshit than say it, I think over time it's building up and it is reflecting in public opinion. Now, I take comfort in that, however, not entirely satisfied because the elites aren't listening to public opinion. I mean, Kamala Harris, in a recent interview last week in Philadelphia, I believe, like one of the moderators was asking her, essentially, asked her 3 times if there would be any change in Israel policy under her administration compared to Biden, and he was practically begging her. So,
was this the NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists interview?
I believe so.
But Madam Vice President, just to follow up really quickly, is there a specific policy change that you, as President of the United States, would say you would do that would help this along? Because you've gotten a lot of credit for emphasizing the humanity of Palestinians. But what I often hear from folks is that there's no policy change that either you or President Biden have gone and said they would do. Is there a specific policy change as president that you would do in our helping of Israel?
We need to get this deal done, and we need to get it done immediately, and that is my position, and that is my policy. We need to get this deal done.
But in the way that we send weapons, in the way that we interact as their ally, are there specific policy changes?
Well, Eugene, for example, one of the things that we have done that I am entirely supportive of is the pause that we've put on the 2,000-pound bombs. And so there is some leverage that we have had and used. But ultimately, the thing that is going to unlock everything else in that region is getting this deal done. And I'm not going to disclose private conversations, but I will tell you, I've had direct conversations with the Prime Minister, with the President of Israel, with Egyptian leaders, and with our allies. And I think we've made ourselves very clear this deal needs to get done in the best interest of everyone in the region, including getting those hostages out who, we saw the latest example of what happened with the 6 most recently, one of whom was an American citizen.
But what do you say to those that say that's not enough, that stopping the 2,000-pound bombs the one time wasn't enough, that this administration, your possible administration, has to do more?
Well, we are doing the work of putting the pressure on all parties involved to get the deal done. But let me be very clear also. I support Israel's ability to defend itself. And I support the need for Palestinians to have dignity, self-determination, and security as we move forward and get a two-state deal done. But right now, the thing we need to get done is this hostage deal and this ceasefire deal. We need a ceasefire. We need the hostage deal.
Yeah, that was a crazy one. I'm glad you brought that up, and I hope we can insert a clip there, because what was so fascinating about that is that this was a group of people that, in all likelihood, it seems based on what I know about them and their reporting profiles and all of that, are kind of pulling for Kamala. But the issue of Palestine has been, I don't know, it has kept, I think, a lot of Black journalists who are generally very centrist and pro-democratic in their orientation. It has created some friction there that you haven't seen in other cycles. So it's a lot of the same people who hated Bernie, for instance, and aren't broadly supportive of left policies, or at least don't think they're very practical, and who are, more positive about a certain sort of representational politics. But on the issue of Palestine, I think you're right. They kept asking her the question because everyone wants a permission structure to go ahead and vote for her, despite what they're seeing on their phone screens every day and the instruction they're seeing on their phone screens. That exchange was written up in that Intercept article. And they specifically raised the issue of leverage and the 2,000-pound bombs, and Biden saying that Rafah was a red line and that he was going to start withholding weaponry around that, which you got a lot of backlash for and ended up not really doing. And Kamala's response to this line of questioning was, so there is some leverage that we have had and used, alluding to the idea that there was at least a threat to withhold weapons that was not followed up upon. What did you make of that?
It's not leverage. I mean, she was referring to what we were talking about earlier with the 2,000 bombs and transitioning to the smaller ones. I mean, again, the Biden administration did pause a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs, but already they had provided over 14,000 of them, and Israel was making prolific use of them. So instead of, they held up that shipment of 2,000-pound bombs, but they said they sent all these smaller bombs in their place, and those were used in war crimes. So it wasn't leverage as much as it was a PR stunt. I mean, throughout this whole conflict, and one of the reasons why I think that ProPublica article has probably more legs than others is the importance of humanitarian assistance in the Biden administration selling us a genocide that's kind and gentle and providing that veneer to it. Israel's just, exercising its right to self-defense. But we're providing all this humanitarian aid to Gaza. So we're doing the right thing here. But it's once those worlds collide a bit where you talk about, the humanitarian situation caused directly by U.S. military aid, then they start to freak out a little bit. So I think that's what we're seeing here.
This question of leverage and why America isn't using it, given that it's supplying all of these weapons to Israel, came up in another Blinken interview that he just did, this time with Samantha Guthrie. She pressed him a little bit on this question. Let's listen to that and get your response.
Let's talk about what's going on right now in the Middle East. As you well know, a massive bombardment by Israel into the north, into Hezbollah territory. The Israeli theory here is escalate to de-escalate. In fact, just in essence, hit Hezbollah so hard they're forced to the negotiating table. Put simply, does the U.S. support this escalation strategy by Israel?
Well, first, Israel has a real and legitimate problem, because here's what happened. After the horrific events of October 7th, by Hamas in Israel, in the south, Hezbollah from Lebanon joined in and started firing rockets into Israel. People who lived in northern Israel had to evacuate their homes. Villages were destroyed, homes were destroyed. 70,000 Israelis were forced from their homes. And Israel started firing back. You had a tit for tat going back and forth. People in southern Lebanon had to leave their homes too. And what everyone wants is to have a secure environment in which people can simply return home. Kids can go back to school. That's what Israel's after. So the best way to get that is not through war, not through escalation. It would be through a diplomatic agreement that has forces pulled back from the border, create a secure environment, people return home. That's what we're driving toward, because while there's a very legitimate issue here, we don't think that war is the solution.
Well, fair enough. Israel is not listening to that. In fact, the U.S. Defense Secretary on Sunday told his Israeli counterpart to give time for diplomacy to work. And on Monday, this Israeli bombardment was the most serious, deadliest day in Lebanon since 2006. Yeah, well, so Israel is not listening to the U.S. Why not?
What we're focused on now, including with many partners here in New York at the UN General Assembly, the Arab world, Europeans and others, is a plan to de-escalate and, again, to make sure that people can go back to their homes. But if there were to be a full-scale war, which we don't have and which we're working to avoid, that's actually not going to solve the problem. It's unlikely that people will be able to return home if there's a full-scale war going on.
What do you make of that? It does feel like this dangling threat of a full-scale war, which many would argue was already upon us, is the constant pivot point when anyone in the Biden administration is asked about diplomatic means to resolving this conflict, which of course would include a ceasefire in Gaza and longer term solutions for what has been this now 76-year occupation.
It's striking to me how ceasefire and diplomacy have been co-opted, just basically to now have like this political theater while they continue to make any diplomatic effort or any ceasefire impossible by continuing to send weapons to Israel. Netanyahu obviously doesn't will not agree to a ceasefire or diplomacy on his own, because if he does, the even more right-wing part of his coalition will fall out of favor with him. His government will collapse, and he'll be indicted on charges of corruption. So that's not something he wants. But again, Israel depends on U.S. weapons. So what Blinken's talking about here and working towards a diplomatic solution just doesn't really make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me at all, in fact. But I think overall, what I'd like to see is a push from the people who were calling for a ceasefire, nobly, who were right to do that early on in the conflict. Everyone who was calling for a ceasefire, if you really, really believe that a ceasefire would de-escalate tensions regarding Israel and Lebanon, which from Hezbollah's standpoint, it would. I mean, they said they'll continue to resist so as long as Israel keeps bombing Gaza. So the obvious solution would be a ceasefire, which would turn it off. But that ceasefire won't be achieved unless there's an arms embargo. So if you truly believe in a ceasefire, you must call for an arms embargo at this point.
And you're saying that there won't be a ceasefire unless there's an arms embargo because Netanyahu has committed to there not being a ceasefire in the next 45 days. Is that right?
I don't know what he said. I mean, but all I know is that he's showing maps of greater Israel where there's no West Bank and no Palestine, and the borders are moved up. I mean, I think the long-term objective, if Netanyahu has his way and this continues along this track, is for Israel to invade Lebanon and reoccupy the southern portion of it. Now, that will go very poorly for them because Hezbollah has spent the last decade fighting ISIS in Lebanon, and they're really quite competent when it comes to effectively insurgency and in fighting insurgencies. So, just like so Israel would be staring down, if not an outright military defeat, they wouldn't be able to secure victory at all. I mean, they're not even able to secure victory in Gaza against Hamas, but Hezbollah is way more powerful. Now, if I say this, I mean, it sounds like I'm defending Hezbollah, which I am, but to defend their actions doesn't mean you necessarily belong to the party of God or agree with their policies. I don't. I lived in Lebanon. I can say that. Although they do have a cool museum in Melita.
I mean, but to be clear though, I'm just following up on this reporting that I saw about the ceasefire talks, Netanyahu's latest, we're not doing a ceasefire round of discourse. But to your point, I mean, when you say that there has to be an American arms embargo for there to be a ceasefire, that is to say it has to be taken out of Netanyahu's hands entirely. It has to be made the case that he can no longer pursue a siege on Gaza. Otherwise, he will never choose, or at least in the short term, choose to stop on his own volition.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, it's striking. It's not just that Israel relies on it. I mean, of course, U.S. has leverage over every country it provides arms to. That's like a stated reason for the U.S. dominate global arms trade every year, is because they claim, the State Department does, that it's able to shape behavior through these arms sales, which it is, but it's just not choosing to use that leverage, obviously, for Israel. But even more than that, in this grand political bargaining, U.S. arms to Israel fuels, Israel's strategic decision, obviously, to expand into Lebanon, but also down to the tactical level. Like a retired senior ranking official in the Israeli army told Haaretz that Israel could have achieved the same amount of progress as it has in Gaza using 10% of the munitions it has used. So effectively, so assured that the U.S. will be there to arm them unconditionally, Israeli units are just there, firing way more rounds than they would otherwise have to do. Now, keep in mind, these are IDF people and they're deranged, so they would like to do that anyway. But I'm talking totally beyond the pale of not just, even beyond their sanity is that they're able to. That is the most important thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just found the pieces is reporting from Haaretz from a few days ago, titled, "As U.S. election nears, the Biden administration is paralyzed in phase of Israel-Hezbollah escalation. The U.S. faces a strategic dilemma as Israel escalates attacks on Hezbollah, risking a broader conflict, while Washington seeks to prevent war. It is constrained by limited policy options, political timing, and Netanyahu's brinkmanship." And then it goes on to say that the election day at the time of writing this article was 45 days away. And Netanyahu says he will not engage in any ceasefire and hostage talks in the next 45 days, nor will he accept any diplomatic ideas concerning Lebanon. So now here's the framing. It's interesting. It's perverse, right? But it's interesting that we're in this dynamic where if you believe Netanyahu would prefer for Donald Trump to be president and is holding, maybe bad choice of words, but holding us collectively hostage on any ceasefire negotiations so that it looks bad for the Biden-Harris administration and Harris's, and it looks bad to Harris's base. What does that do to arguments about whether or not there would be more or less peace if Harris or Trump were in office? If the argument is that Netanyahu is in league with Trump and Trump is bad, fine. I don't need to be convinced that Trump is bad. But if the argument is that Netanyahu will engage in sincere ceasefire talks and stop this genocidal siege if Donald Trump is president, well, in what directions does that argument actually cut for the people who are trying to say, oh, stop trying to push Harris to the left on this issue. Trump is going to be worse. Just vote blue no matter who.
I never really understood that argument, to be honest with you. And now I didn't understand it in October and November, and I especially don't understand it now, because what daylight is there between Biden, Harris, and Trump now? I just don't see it. Like, one of the things that many Democrats complained about Trump is that he defunded UNRWA, the UN agency for Palestinian refugees. Now, it's a whole other thing of why, very right-wing people in the US and Israel want to, attack UNRWA literally or figuratively. It's because it's for Palestinian refugees. And it says, it's implied right there in the name that there are Palestinian refugees, and that implies that they have a home to return to.
And my understanding is that UNRWA is like part of this grand bargain where the UN is founded in the wake of World War II. It's supposed to be, kind of symbolic of a new kind of global political mediation order. So we don't have any of these kinds of conflicts, these global wars again. We don't have a Holocaust again. But as part of the bargain post-Holocaust, you have this creation of the state of Israel. And there's this tension between entering a post-colonial era. We're not doing this sort of thing again. We're not doing world wars again. We're not going to act like this. And the choice to establish a Jewish state that is obviously immediately causing this huge refugee crisis. And so the grand bargain was, okay, the UN is going to have UNRWA, this funding for this population that we have now dispossessed, as pittance for a Holocaust that these people had nothing to do with, but we're at least going to throw some money at this problem that we've created. And it's kind of like the original sin of the United Nations. And as that being the case, people have had their fangs bared for UNRWA since the very beginning, because it's sort of evidence of that initial sin, that original sin. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I mean, it was created to, if it wasn't created to, it definitely is one of its main purposes is to reduce the cost of the occupation to Israel. So, for that reason, that's why Trump was criticized for defunding UNRWA, is that it was so just out of left field, whatever the expression is, that U.S. policy would just essentially would not be able to recover from it. It would just put too much stress on Israel. It would become a PR nightmare. It was just unthinkable, and it would tarnish the U.S.'s image as an impartial mediator. How many people actually believe that? I don't know. Probably fewer now. But the Biden administration defunded UNRWA too, twice actually, in the Further Consolidation Appropriations Act of 2024. Language in there defunded UNRWA, and then in Biden's supplemental funding bill, his foreign aid bill, that defunded UNRWA also. So the daylight between Biden and what Harris has said and what Trump will do, it just seems like there isn't any daylight there, really. And I don't know, I'm not sure if Netanyahu would actually prefer Trump. I mean, I understand Trump, the right-wing similarities and all, but considering that, Biden-Harris approved a record $18 billion in military aid for Israel, which is the most ever, more than after the Egypt-Israel peace treaty more than during the October War of 1973. The fact that Biden and Harris in just 3 years have accounted for 11% of total U.S. military aid to Israel, which stands at over $250 billion in 2024 dollars. Do I have these numbers memorized? God, I hate myself. But the thing to remember is, I think that Trump is unpredictable, and Netanyahu is getting his bread from Biden and Harris, and he seems to be quite happy with it. I mean, this is it's really an extremist policy in the White House. Like, even Reagan after some time, told Israel to cut it out. Carter did too. Joe Biden did in 2021. But now it's a policy of extremism.
And so what then do you attribute that to? I mean, I know everyone's asking this question, and there's all kinds of theories that are floating around. You know, is Biden just a true believer and a Zionist to his core and is willing to sacrifice it all for Israel? Is there some, there's people with their Epstein flavored theories. I mean, there's all kinds of rationale that people are grasping for, because fundamentally, most folks believe, and maybe this is in and of itself wrong, that there is a point at which the party as an institution, the Democratic Party, wouldn't be willing to risk it all for a country that has no actual power over the United States of America, that constructively, in the grand scheme of world events, doesn't even have the same sort of geopolitical strategic benefit for the United States as it once did in the region, according to, some other guests that have been on the show and the like. So what do you have a personal theory as to why the Democrats have been willing to the Biden administration specifically has been willing to get itself so deep into this mess?
I think Biden himself is an extremist. I think the people in his administration are career-oriented and refuse of saying no to anyone above them, and Biden's at the top. In Congress, I think it's more corruption-oriented, where I think it's more about AIPAC's lobbying, its campaign financing, the threat of that financing. But I think with Biden, money, the AIPAC money, the pro-Israel lobby money is besides the point. I genuinely think he's down to his core an extremist. But I can't, with that explanation, I can't really explain Kamala Harris's disposition, because the polls are very clear. 77% of Democrats want an arms embargo. More than 60% of all voters, and even more independents, want an arms embargo as well. There are 740,000 uncommitted voters. There's a huge Arab population, namely Palestinian and Lebanese, in a critical swing state of Michigan. And there's, just basically the disenchanted people who, for good reason, consider genocide to be a red line in supporting a candidate. So there's no really rhyme or reason to it, not from a national security standpoint or a political reason, moral reason, definitely. So I can't really figure her out because she doesn't seem quite as extreme, genuinely extreme, as Biden is. Maybe it's just she's part of the cadre of politicians that grew up worshiping Hillary Clinton, and she's just like, yeah, I don't really have any real convictions, so I'll just go with whatever. I don't know.
It's possible, but it doesn't. Like, she doesn't. The flip side of us living in a binary two-party system where nobody has options, like the voters don't have options, we're all stuck, blah blah blah, blue no matter who, is that political funders also don't have options, right? Like, so if there's like in their ability as people in positions of power to kind of collectively say we're only going to go so far, is much more so than us organizing millions of Americans to say we're going to withhold our vote or you have to listen to us for various reasons. And it does seem like if we're at a point where it's so politically toxic to both parties and there's nowhere, for the Israel lobby to jump, there's no alternative. And both parties are saying, no, we're not going to bankrupt our country. We're not going to get into World War III. We're not going to commit more of our troops to die in the Middle East. You've gotten an enormous amount for us, but this is the line in the sand. Why they can't stick that landing. I mean, you have, and moreover, the AIPAC funding feels like it's more of an issue for individual congressional candidates who need to win elections with much smaller kind of budget horizons than a presidential candidate who's able to win collect, solicit $70 million in a night post debate. The numbers aren't exactly flying for me, although I will say this. I just went over to Open Secrets after the debate and after she kept repeating that most lethal army line to try to figure out the bottom of this question, and discovered, you're chuckling because I'm sure you know this already, given the kind of work and research you do, but that in terms of defense company recipients, Kamala Harris tops the list over Donald Trump, receiving $1.3 million to Donald Trump's $821,000
from military contractors.
That's right.
Yeah. That
even then, those numbers aren't that big. You know what I mean? To lose an election over.
Right. And the arms industry has to work with whoever's in power. And like the Israel lobby, if they get too close to one side, if they get too partisan, then they start to lose their power. So they're tied to the Democratic Party either way. The problem, as I see it, is that the Democratic Party is becoming more hawkish. And I think that's crystal clear. Have you read the 2024 platform by chance, the Democratic Party platform for 2024?
No. I mean, I have taken note, especially in light of the last 24 hours events, of their omission of the death penalty as something that they oppose, but I haven't actually read the platform. What should we be aware of?
It is shockingly unambitious and unambiguously hawkish. It is really something else. So as an example, you brought the lethal military line, which I found haunting. And by the way, that line actually has origins in Trump's 2018 National Defense Strategy, which calls for investing in a more lethal force. And then the 2022 National Defense Strategy adopted that language and literally said in the document that we're building off the 2018 National Defense Strategy. And a key portion of that is, broader military spending, of course, but particularly modernizing the nuclear arsenal. So getting back to the platform, in the 2020 platform, for example, Democrats criticized Trump's spending on nuclear weapons, calling it brash, etc., slammed him rightfully for leaving the Iran nuclear deal. The 2024 version of the Democratic Party platform celebrates Biden's spending on nuclear weapons. So Biden requested for next year $69 billion, which is, when Trump left office, it was, in real terms, the nuclear budget was less than $50 billion, I believe. So, just in the same way that Trump radically increased the nuclear budget, Biden has done the same thing. And same with broader military spending as well. Biden has significantly outpaced Trump, in fact. And that, it's just basically a thing to keep an eye on. And I'd love to actually hear your analysis of it. If you ever get a chance to read it, please let me know. But it's basically the 2024 platform is Democrats celebrating Biden for doing, essentially bragging about what Biden did during his presidency and what he will continue to do on issues that they slammed Trump for doing in the 2020 platform. And again, there's no public option for healthcare. There's no, massive call for climate investments. It's really shockingly unambitious. And I think I was talking to one presidential candidate who we both know recently, and she said it was a function of the Democrats canceling effectively the primaries, the debates, because there was no option on, in 2020. Remember, the politics of the 2020 platform? You would remember better than me on how, progressive at least got some wins in there.
The battle back then was, someone who worked for the Bernie campaign was to illustrate how bad faith everybody else's claims of progressivism were. But at least they had to pretend to be progressive at the time because Bernie was in the mix. His policies were popular, and everyone else had to justify why they didn't support common sense policies Medicare for all, $15 minimum wage, things that aren't even like more out there, like his very progressive labor policy or anything like that, just like bedrock things that used to be a part of the Democratic Party platform and used to be Democratic Party priorities. And that's why we had all of these discourses that we don't have anymore. The reparations discourse was an invention. I'm sorry, like I support reparations, but I'm also not going to sit here and play along with the idea that Kamala Harris or what's his name, Julian Castro or any of them who pretended to support reparations back then were doing it for any reason other than that Bernie answered the question and got a lot of flack for it in 2016. And so in 2019, as things were ramping up again, they were like, okay, if we bring up reparations, it'll make Bernie look bad. We're people of color. He's going to let the out of touch white guy. Have you heard any of them say a mumbling word about it since then? No. And it's like that with all of these other policies that completely disappeared from the public discourse. So I do believe that presidential candidate is right, that not having a primary really negatively impacted the discourse. That being said, 2020 is an illustration of how shallow, superficial commitments to those policies that are made in the 11th hour up and until the genuine progressive candidate is kicked out of the race are meaningless. And I would like to believe it would work out differently, but there is also a world where we did have a real primary with a real progressive, and all of them pretended to care about X, Y, and Z. The progressive ultimately loses because of the chicanery they always engage in. And then just like Joe Biden in 2020, all of those commitments fall by the wayside immediately.
But we did in 2020. I mean, I'm the last person to defend Biden, but he did offer an infrastructure bill, which eventually just became sort of a giant highway bill, unfortunately. But the Build Back Better Act, for example, I don't think he was ever serious about getting it passed because he delinked it from the infrastructure bill, which, especially by the end, was the bribe to get Manchin, Sinema, et cetera, on board. But if you look at like what he actually proposed and what the bill that passed the House, I mean, Kamala Harris isn't even going near the scale of what that actually had in the bill. It's shocking. Like, she proposed the expanded child tax credit, which is great, but Medicaid, home care, investments, the huge investment in climate, these things just aren't there. Earned income tax credit example, they're just not at the scale. Like, it's just, again, like I don't know, like I don't like she's there was a clear shift from Biden to Harris when it came to defining and talking about the economy. Biden was talking about GDP, just pretty much making up numbers what they go around, but no one knows what the fuck GDP is. Harris has actually talked about, like household living conditions, like food and financial insecurity. But she hasn't issued anything close to Build Back Better, which would have helped. No, she just says,
I come from a middle-class family. I come from a middle-class family.
And here's my personal experience coming at that. I grew up a middle-class kid.
Well, I'll start with this. I grew up a middle-class kid.
My mother was hardworking. She raised me and my sister Maya.
My mother raised my sister and me. She worked very hard.
She saved up, and it was only by the time I was a teenager that she could afford to actually buy her first home.
She was able to finally save up enough money to buy our first house when I was a teenager.
And that should make you feel comfortable that there is some policy coming down the pike that could actually address your needs. You had a question about the economy. Did you know that Kamala Harris came from a middle-class family? Oy vey. Okay. I was actually talking about this or thinking about this earlier because Adam Johnson, host of one of my favorite podcasts, Citations Needed, tweeted about this phenomenon, not just that there's a rightward shift in the Democratic Party leadership, but also among voters, because voters are following what the leadership is prescribing. And I observed this back in 2020 that I remember seeing a poll about the popularity of fracking kind of at the beginning and the end of the year, like at the end of the primary season and then like just before the general election vote, and how Biden being the pick and then coming out against or in favor of fracking, and the framing of it as being, we need to frack to win Pennsylvania and stop Trump actually created like a 20-point, if I'm remembering correctly, a 20-point swing in voter attitudes toward fracking over the course of a summer. So it's like there's one level of pernicious where, captured politicians don't do what the public wants. It's another level of you're having the effect of setting back the entire population by convincing them that the things that majorities want are antithetical to their electoral goals, and therefore they should give up on populist ideas. And obviously, Black Lives Matter saw that same sort of retrenchment over the course of the summer. If we say we care about this stuff, then we're going to lose to Trump. So we got to just stuff that movement into the memory bank. And I very much worry about that with Kamala Harris, especially because, again, we have someone who's younger, someone who has the veneer of progressivism simply because of her identity, who we're told, and this comes back to the Chappell Roan of it all, if you push back against her at all or make any demand of the Democratic Party, then you're a fake queer and, you secretly love Trump and, you deserve to be put in the gulag that all of the gays are going to be put in when Trump inevitably wins and it's all your fault. And it's dark. It's dark times. As we wrap here, I want to make sure we get to this one last clip because today, as we're recording, Joe Biden did go on the most important political show in America, The View, and offered a little bit more on the question of Israel. And perhaps this clip will maybe provide some more evidence one way or another about this question of whether he's being driven by like sincere, heartfelt zealotry and love of Zionism or something else.
An all-out war is possible, but I think there's also the opportunity, or still in play, to have a settlement that could fundamentally change the whole region. Mm-hmm. And I look, one of the things that I found is the Arab world very much wants to have a settlement because they know what it does for them. Mm-hmm. They're willing to make arrangements with Israel and alliances with Israel if Israel changes some policies. And I've known Bibi Netanyahu for a long, long time. And I'm a very strong supporter of Israel. I make no bones about it. Mm-hmm. I said years ago I was a Zionist. All a Zionist means is that there needs to be an Israel. Mm-hmm. And the fact is, though, that Bibi has a picture I signed for him when he was a young member of the embassy here in the United States. And it was 8x10 picture he asked me to sign. I wrote, Bibi, I love you, but don't agree with a damn thing you say or do, Joe. Yeah. And I do, and it's right. I don't agree with his position. There needs to be a two-state solution. Ultimately, it needs to happen. There's a way to do it, and we have a possibility. I don't want to exaggerate it, but a possibility if we can deal with a ceasefire in Lebanon, that it can move into dealing with the West Bank. But we also have Gaza to deal with. Yes. And so, but it's possible, and I'm using every bit of energy I have with my team, and from the Defense Department, it well, to get this done. There's a desire to see change, in the region.
All right, a reaffirmation that he is a Zionist. But what a weird kind of a tonal thing where he seems to be playing this game where it's Bibi and I have known each other a long time. We're ostensibly close, but I've been telling him this whole time that I don't agree with anything that he believes or what he says. And yet I'm not going to stop him by using an arms embargo as leverage.
Yeah, he just tried to make it out like the tail wags the dog, but that's not what's happening in this case. Again, everything that Israel is doing would not be possible without the United States. Yes, Israel was more than capable of taking its lump of flesh in response to October 7th, and I think it would have been within its rights to. It's certainly in compliance with international law. They could have done that, but because it wanted a genocide, it called Joe Biden. It's as simple as that. And again, it's a shocking co-optation of the word ceasefire and diplomacy when you're not actually doing either of those things. At least you're, saying you are, but you're actively obstructing and sabotaging your own efforts by the one thing that not just Biden, but Harris and the whole Democratic Party decided is non-negotiable, which is military aid to Israel. So that's really, again, the bottom line for all this. I mean, that, keeping that in mind essentially blows apart this whole diplomatic theater they have going on.
It really is incredible that they get to keep doing this theater in large part because I don't know that I've ever seen an interview where Biden or Harris or Blinken or any of these the spokespeople get good pushback all the time from those journalists, but any of the principals have simply had the pushback of, no, you could stop this by doing an arms embargo. Why are you choosing otherwise? You are complicit and there's no way, this
is why you should be on The View. What was Alyssa Farah doing? Just nodding. What are the rest of the people doing? They're saying, oh yeah, okay. What are these people thinking? Or is that like getting into their heads might be a bit, might be one of those, questions you might not prefer to ask, like why so many couples in DC look like they could be brother and sister. It's just like, do you really want to ask that?
Steven,
I don't know.
Well, you should listen to you shouldn't, but if you do listen to the rest of the segment, it'll provide some insight, because the parts that I caught where Whoopi Goldberg averring in a way that nobody asked for, that she loves Biden. She didn't like the way that Biden was kicked out of the race, that she was going to go down with the ship, that she was going to follow him to the very end, that she's a Biden acolyte. And then Biden talking about how old he is, but how he still thought he could beat Trump, and how he's like so weirded out by his own age that he doesn't want to talk about it out loud. And then Joy Behar chiming in saying, well, I'm the same age as you, Biden, in a way that kind of felt like a brag, because she seems in much better shape, like cognitively and even physically, than Biden. It was a mess. Yeah. It was a mess. And my beliefs being what they are, and my willingness to say being what it is, say what I believe being what it is exactly why I will never be on The View. But here we are. We're on bad faith. We got bad faith.
It does. Well, you have a wave of public support behind you if you do, because you're absolutely have been an indispensable voice all along. But Brianna, especially since October 7th, you have been a bona fide world ass kicker. You have been incredible. Oh. Not just with your show, but with your tweets. And, some of the stuff I learned from you, like your pieces to camera on the one program run by the one company that shall not be named, but you were just absolutely dominant in those, and just truly, truly admirable performances. And they went viral for a reason.
Yeah. And I was fired from doing that for a reason, but I am working my way back to trying to write some more of those radars. I'll have to come up with something else to call them, but I do appreciate you saying that. And I really return the sentiment. Thank you for doing all of the research that you do. And can you tell the audience where they can find more of you and your writing on the internet and beyond?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at Steven Semler or at stevensemler.com. I write a Substack called Polygraph, where I make a lot of graphs. It's kind of just a shitty joke, but the content is extraordinarily good, and a lot of research goes into it. The pieces are short, so you don't even have to read what I say, but you'll walk away from every post with some hard data. And I've been told that I've been written by, high school teachers, that they use my content in classes, that podcasters, and the manner in which I'm most proud, which is people pulling my chart up on during a Twitter conversation to call the person they're arguing with a dumbass. So that's what I'm most proud of.
No, the charts go viral because, it distills a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the asymmetry of aid, the spike, the disproportionate volume of aid that's been going to Israel, and also comparing the amount of money that's spent on domestic social programs to that aid. It really provides a crystal clear visualization of what has been so upsetting to so many people, frankly, across the political spectrum, as they wonder why life seems to be getting worse for them in the United States of America, as we experience an historic period without a minimum wage raise, as we experience a retrenchment of these social programs, but as the spending faucet never is turned off when it comes to wars. So thank you for all of that work, Stephen. Thank you for listening. You can get an extra episode of Bad Faith Podcast every week on Mondays if you subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Until then, take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.